Thank you, Ranking Member Blumenauer, subcommittee members, and certainly our witnesses for being here today. Today's hearing is an important step as Congress considers the renewal of the Generalized System of Preferences Program, or GSP. When Congress created the GSP program in 1974, it recognized then, as we do now, U.S. leadership on international trade and global economic development is vital. We may have had different global adversaries in 1974, but this still holds true today as we contend with the strategic and economic threat presented by the Chinese Communist Party. There's no question the GSP program has a proven track record. However, I do not believe we should forgo the opportunity to examine ways to improve it. GSP is meant to foster economic growth in developing countries by providing duty-free access to the U.S. market while increasing standards in these countries through strict eligibility criteria set by Congress. Today, we will focus on how well the program has achieved these goals and explore ways it can be improved. As we will hear today, GSP also helps create and support American jobs, many of which are in our districts. Amid high inflation and exacerbated by the administration's so-called Bidenomics, lower tariffs ultimately bring savings to those who need it the most. At the same time, GSP preserves American production by excluding import-sensitive products from the program. USTR maintains a robust process to periodically update this list, and we must carefully consider whether this process works as intended. We will hear from witnesses today about a range of potential reforms that could make the program more effective in its strategic and economic goals, and I look forward to this thoughtful discussion. For example, we have seen GSP be a successful enforcement tool for USTR, including helping open markets for U.S. agriculture. This is especially important given the Biden administration's very limited engagement to reduce tariffs or otherwise increase market access for American farmers and ranchers. I'm also interested in hearing more about a potential new criterion for digital trade. I'm very concerned by the range of discriminatory policies, including taxes, which seek to undermine the leadership of U.S. companies when it comes to digital trade. I appreciate the leadership of Congressman LaHood in this very regard. Additionally, I look forward to hearing about how GSP can be reformed to better align our domestic supply chain goals. If done strategically, GSP can help shift key supply chains out of adversarial nations like China. GSP alone won't be the answer to our supply chain challenges, but it certainly can be a helpful tool. Lastly, while the focus of this hearing is on GSP, I would be remiss if I did not mention another key trade program in our arsenal, which has expired as well. The Miscellaneous Tariffs Bill, or MTB, is another important tool many job creators and consumers rely on, and I look forward to conversations about how to get both these programs on a pathway to swift renewal. I hope we can come together on a bipartisan basis and break the logjam that has held back GSP renewal since it expired at the end of 2020. Yes, that is 2020. I am confident we can do the hard work necessary to reform and renew GSP. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Mr. Blumenauer for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. Today's hearing comes at an important juncture for the GSP, our oldest trade preference program. Since this program was established in the 70s to extend benefits to sectors of developing countries which were not competitive. To say some GSP beneficiary countries have sophisticated and large economies with globally competitive sectors that receive duty-free access to our market. The global economic landscape has fundamentally changed since the 1970s. China, for instance, was not the second largest economy then, nor were the supply chains nearly as globalized. While GSP has supported economic opportunities abroad, and it has been leveraged to improve standards in developing countries, including worker rights, in its current form, GSP does not reflect the evolution of trade policy. That's why House Democrats sought common sense and equitable reforms to GSP previously. Such reforms included updating GSP's labor criteria, adding an environmental criterion, a human rights criterion, and making the GSP program more transparent. Last year, we were ready to move on these common sense and equitable reforms to GSP. We proposed updating GSP to advance the rights of working people around the world. GSP reforms should improve labor standards abroad and support workers in developing nations, especially those who face gender-based violence in the workplace. House Democrats also support adding an environmental criterion to GSP, which current GSP eligibility criteria do not include. One of the greatest challenges in the last 40 years is the awareness of climate change. The American people expect us to address this climate crisis. Adding an effective environmental criterion to GSP would align the program with our broader trade policy, which has elevated environmental and conservation issues in our broader trade policy. As we hear from Ray Houseman from the United Steelworkers, there should not be loopholes to enforcement in the form of requiring that violations of GSP's labor and environmental criteria be, quote, sustained or reoccurring, and should shown to have occurred in a manner, quote, affecting trade, to be actionable in a GSP review. Another topic we ought to address in our bill concerns the rules of origin for the GSP program. As Roy points out in his testimony, in its current form, GSP allows for most of a product to come from a non-GSP country and get GSP treatment. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to address this issue as we work to improve and renew GSP. I'm certainly open to the conversation on digital trade, but if we're serious about supporting the American worker, I think we ought to address the fact that we need to reauthorize and reform trade adjustment assistance. We need to ensure that the American economy have all the tools they need to be able to succeed in the global economy. That's why last Congress, House Democrats passed legislation that renewed and reformed GSP and TAA. If this Congress is going to reimburse duties for GSP imports, it should also reauthorize TAA. I stand ready to work with my Republican colleagues and turn our rhetoric into action. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on these issues as we consider ways to update the GSP and build on activities we had in the past. Thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. I now have the pleasure of introducing our witnesses for today's hearing. First, Mr. Edward Gresser, Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute. Next, Randall Spronk, a pork producer from Minnesota and also the former president of the National Pork Producers Council. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Moore from Utah to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am honored to introduce Fabian Garza, the Vice President of Operations for Black Diamond Equipment, a major outdoor and recreation equipment manufacturer based in my home state of Utah. Mr. Garza has a deep background in supply chain management, and he has helped turn Black Diamond into a major player on the international stage in this space. Much of this is thanks to the Generalized Systems of Preference program we are discussing today. I have previously met with Black Diamond to discuss their trade priorities, and I'm confident that their testimony will shed some valuable light on the challenges caused by the program's expiration. I'm thrilled to have a great Utah company here with us today. Their experience speaks to what many in this sector face. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. We also have Nigel Cory, Associate Director of Trade Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and also Mr. Roy Houseman, the Legislative Director of the United Steelworkers Union. Thank you for all joining us today, and your written statement will be made a part of the record. Each of you have 5 minutes to deliver your remarks. You'll see the lights on there when it turns yellow, if you wouldn't mind bringing the plane in for a landing so we can keep on schedule here. Mr. Gresser, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm Vice President of the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, and from 2015 until 2021 served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Policy and Economics, with responsibilities including overseeing administration of the GSP. As a brief introduction, the GSP operates by waiving tariffs on about 3,600 tariff lines for goods viewed as non-import sensitive from 119 low and middle income beneficiary countries. In exchange for this, it asks the beneficiaries to comply with 15 eligibility criteria on issues ranging from market access to labor standards, resource cartels, and intellectual property rights. In 2020, the year before it lapsed, GSP covered $17 billion worth of imports, This was about 11% of imports from the beneficiary countries and about 0.7% of our total $2.35 trillion in imports that year. GSP adds value in three areas. First, development and poverty alleviation as countries diversify their economies and create new jobs. Examples include Cambodian-made backpacks and suitcases, a direct result of Chairman Smith's work to make travel goods eligible in 2015, Kenyan horticulture, Armenian and Lebanese jewelry, Haitian mangoes and flags, Ukrainian paint and carpentry supplies, and tropical agriculture and fishery products from Fiji and the Solomon Islands. Second, it provides sourcing alternatives for American buyers, in particular to China. Travel goods are again an example. In 2014, China accounted for 61% of U.S. imports of these goods, and GSP countries 4%. By 2018, the shares had shifted to 54% and 12%. Now they are 23% for China and 39% for the GSP countries. And third, it supports U.S. policy in the areas covered by the eligibility criteria. Successful examples during my tenure included reform of Bolivian child labor law, passage of a national workplace health and safety law in Georgia, resolution of U.S. concerns related to dairy, horticultural, and meat exports in Indonesia and Argentina, digital data localization programs in Indonesia, and helping to end systematic forced labor and child labor in Uzbekistan's cotton industry. As the subcommittee considers reauthorization, renewal as is not, I think, a bad option, as the program functions reasonably well. However, I share the view implicit in various reauthorization proposals that it could be updated and it can be improved. I'm happy to share specific experiences and ideas, but we'll start with three general points. One is to set priorities. Changes to GSP, I think, should be designed to serve Congress' top policy goals. If a core aim is to encourage sourcing diversification and alternatives to China, U.S. buyers should see GSP as a valuable and generally stable benefit that supports long-term planning. This suggests a long authorization term, possibly greater economic value, perhaps through broader product eligibility, reform of competitive need limits, and/or study of rule of origin reforms, and confidence that removal of benefits would occur only for very serious noncompliance. Alternatively, a focus on eligibility rules suggests a limited list of clearly defined criteria, ensuring that administrations center their work on these issues and beneficiary countries understand their importance, and criteria flexible enough to ensure that governments acting in good faith but with limited policy capacity, which is often the case for low-income countries and small islands, can qualify. Second, new requirements for administrations operating the system. Several bills envision codifying the triennial assessment of beneficiary countries for compliance with the eligibility rules that we conducted from 2017 to 2020. This system, designed by the late Arland Herfindahl, who was then the deputy for GSP, provided the first look at all the beneficiary countries since the 1970s, and I think serves as a very valuable and useful baseline. I think it's a good innovation and appreciate the interest in extending it. I also note proposals for new reporting requirements where I do have some concern. Administrations very much need to keep Congress informed as they work on eligibility and product addition or removal, and they need to provide a public record of their decisions and rationales. But the GSP staff is very small, typically it's 2 full-time people, and a very ambitious reporting requirement may be quite difficult for them to manage. Third, and most important, I believe, an expeditious renewal. Restoring benefits is the key step, whether we hope to add value for development, poverty alleviation, and workers in beneficiary countries, to encourage supply chain security and diversification, or to support U.S. policy goals. So I applaud the subcommittee for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to offer whatever help I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gresser. Mr. Spronk, you are now recognized.
Good afternoon, Trade Subcommittee Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, and members of the subcommittee. I am Randy Spronk, a pork producer and farmer from Pipestone, Minnesota. My family and I farm 2,500 acres of corn, soybeans, and hybrid rye. And we'll market about 265,000 butcher hogs annually. I'm a past president of the National Pork Producers Council and represent them on USDA's Agricultural Policy Advisory Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of NPPC and the nation's 66,000 pork producers. Trade is crucial to the U.S. pork industry. Last year, we exported nearly $7.7 billion of pork. Those exports supported 155,000 mostly rural jobs and added $14.5 billion to the country's GDP. More importantly, exports equated to around $61 in value for every hog that was marketed in 2022. The U.S. pork industry, like a lot of industries, has gone through some tough times in the past several years, but exports continue to be a bright spot for producers. Our trade successes can be largely attributed to our ability to produce the world's safest, most nutritious, most affordable pork in the world, and have fair and unfettered access to foreign markets negotiated through comprehensive trade agreements. It's very clear such agreements are why U.S. exports more pork to the 20 countries that we have free trade agreements with than the rest of the world combined. Another tool critically important to obtaining market access for U.S. pork is the Generalized System of Preferences, which has unfortunately been expired since the end of 2020. Pork producers supported the objectives of GSP program to offer opportunities to many of the world's poorest countries to use trade to grow their economies and climb out of poverty. We believe that promoting the economic growth and development of GSP recipient countries is a good business proposition because increased income and buying power in those markets will create future export opportunities for U.S. pork producers. We also view the GSP program as a very important trade enforcement tool that gives U.S. trade negotiators leverage to address market access concerns. As an example, GSP was successfully used as leverage to obtain market access for U.S. pork producers in India. At the time of the petition in 2017, India was the #1 recipient of preferential trade benefits under the U.S. GSP program and restricted or prohibited the import of many U.S. agricultural products, including my product, pork. The list of restrictions was quite extensive, but through the leverage created by GSP, U.S. government was able to successfully negotiate away a long list of issues. Currently, U.S. pork industry is working on exporting its first shipments of U.S. pork to India. While the threat of removing GSP benefits can induce countries to improve market access conditions for U.S. pork, the possibility of being added to the eligibility list is another mechanism for countries to remove long-standing barriers. Argentina, for example, was under consideration for GSP eligibility in 2018. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was able to use that leverage to finalize the development of an export certificate for U.S. pork, giving us market access. Another example where GSP could use as leverage is with Thailand, which has a de facto ban on U.S. pork today. The country maintains high tariffs and several non-tariff trade barriers on U.S. pork, despite getting duty-free access to the United States under GSP. In 2018, NPPC successfully petitioned for a review of Thailand's GSP benefits. As a result of that review, Thailand's duty-free access under GSP was suspended on October 30, 2020. However, current expiration of GSP has removed an important incentive for Thailand or other GSP-eligible countries to provide equitable market access to U.S. pork. That's why it's critical to renew GSP. NPPC would like to urge Congress to consider the addition of stronger enforcement mechanisms in the GSP program to ensure that recipient countries are providing equitable and reasonable access to their markets. A mechanism that more quickly responds to unjustified barriers imposed by GSP recipient countries would also be welcomed. In conclusion, U.S. pork producers support the renewal of GSP. We believe it is a valuable tool and a valuable program that will give U.S. trade negotiators another tool to get countries to eliminate trade restrictions on U.S. products. Furthermore, a renewal of GSP should include stronger enforcement mechanisms that provide trade negotiators the tools to ensure countries are meeting their obligations. Thank you for allowing me to testify. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Spronk. Mr. Garza, you are now recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, committee and subcommittee members. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. My name is Fabian Garza, Vice President of Operations at Black Diamond Equipment, and I am responsible for guiding our global supply chain strategies and sourcing directions. While I represent Black Diamond today, our stance resonates with the broader sentiments of the Outdoor Industry Association. Black Diamond is headquartered in Salt Lake City, Utah, and specializes in creating outdoor equipment and apparel, primarily for climbing, skiing, trail running, and hiking. Emerging from Chouinard Equipment alongside Patagonia, our company was established in 1989 and has since thrived emphasizing quality, environmental sustainability, and broadening mountain communities. We currently employ 321 U.S. professionals, with 49 specializing in manufacturing here in the U.S. In 2006, Black Diamond ventured into manufacturing in Zhuhai, China. However, by 2015, we closed our operations in China and diversified globally while also amplifying our U.S. manufacturing. A crucial tool in this strategic shift was GSP. Now our imports encompass over 20 countries, largely with GSP-eligible products from Cambodia, the Philippines, and Pakistan. GSP's duty-free advantages, especially on products like backpacks and duffel bags, with duties up to 20%, are invaluable for our scale. Regrettably, the 2020 GSP expiration burdened the outdoor sector with approximately $1.7 billion in tariffs. Black Diamond shouldered over $1 million of that. The financial setback, compounded by unpredictable market and economic challenges, has made many industry players consider reverting their manufacturing back to China. Black Diamond is not taking this stance. However, we are halting hiring key positions, postponing crucial product development, and deferred essential initiatives. A retroactive GSP reinstatement and recovering the duties is of paramount importance. Additionally, there's an urgent need to reassess the competitive needs limitations within GSP to better serve businesses aiming to diversify supply chains away from China. The current annual increment in CNLs does not reflect the shift of production from China to developing countries. This deviates from the legislation's original intent and imposes growth constraints at unjustifiably low levels. The addition of travel goods to GSP, along with the 2017 extension to all beneficiary countries by Ambassador Lighthizer, led to a considerable shift away from China. However, by creating a solid domestic industry is a prolonged process. Countries like Indonesia have already surpassed CNL benchmarks for backpacks, while Philippines is nearing the threshold. If genuine diversification from China is our goal, optimizing resources like GSP is essential. Now pivoting to Black Diamond's commitment to enhancing U.S. manufacturing, we, like other businesses, depend on imported materials for domestic production. The existing tariffs, especially China's Section 301 tariffs, unintentionally affect American companies. Tariffs on raw materials, with many finished products being exempt, pose challenges, especially when certain unique components are only accessible in China. High tariffs, up to 25% on some components, drastically impact our operations. As discussions on shifting supply chains from China continue, the significance of initiatives like GSP is paramount, as opposed to generalized tariffs adversely influencing U.S. sectors. While prioritizing GSP renewal, we also seek a new Section 301 exclusion process, balanced tariffs for non-critical U.S. manufacturers, or any tariff relief that Congress might consider in the trade package. A final item very important to OIA is the miscellaneous tariff bill process, which historically has moved in tandem with GSP. We hope Congress will reauthorize that program as well. In conclusion, this testimony underscores GSP's critical impact on companies like Black Diamond. Thank you for letting me share our journey and insights.
Thank you, Mr. Garza. Mr. Cory, you are recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumenauer, members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to testify about reforming GSP to address digital trade barriers. Let me start by saying that just as global trade has gone digital, so has protectionism. Many countries are enacting discriminatory behind-the-border regulations on digital products and services to target US firms and in order to give their local competitors a leg up. This digital protectionism is spreading. The number of local data requirements, a popular protectionist tool, has more than doubled in recent years, from 67 in 2017 to over 144 in 2021. The digital protectionism toolkit is much broader, including discriminatory licensing, product reviews and certification processes, digital service taxes, and local digital content requirements. China is the world leader in digital protectionism. It pioneered the practice and refined it in targeting US firms and products. Now many developing countries are following suit. Several GSP beneficiaries have enacted barriers to digital trade or are considering it. For example, in 2019, nearly $3 billion of Indonesia's exports to the United States benefited from GSP access, representing nearly 14% of their total exports to the US. Yet Indonesia has enacted or is considering major digital restrictions, including local data storage, a digital services tax, and duties on imports of digital content. Similarly, in 2019, $346 million of Pakistan's exports to the United States benefited from the GSP, representing nearly 9% of their total exports to the US. Yet it too is considering a range of restrictive digital trade barriers. Why should we care? Digital protectionism has already cost the United States dearly, especially in China, and it'll cost us even more if GSP countries are allowed to get away with it, just as their digital economies are growing in countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Thailand, Nigeria, Kenya, the Philippines, and elsewhere. The US will only benefit if they have fair and reasonable market access to these markets. For example, US digital trade exports to Indonesia were worth nearly $250 million in 2021, which is nearly a 90% increase since 2010. In 5 or 10 years' time, it could be much higher than that, but only if US firms and digital products have fair and reasonable market access. GSP provides the United States with critical leverage to force reforms. It's time Congress and the administration take this up by adding an explicit criterion for digital trade barriers and by making reporting and transparency reforms to ensure it's applied consistently and effectively. Former USTR Lighthizer demonstrated just how useful this could be in elevating the importance of digital trade barriers in several GSP reviews that he conducted, forcing concrete changes in certain countries like Indonesia. These GSP changes are important for 3 key reasons. Firstly, it would support the digital trade that fosters US economic competitiveness, innovation, and job creation. In 2021, the United States exported nearly $90 billion in ICT services. Digital trade is democratized trade, as SMEs can use the internet and digital technologies to access customers and markets all around the world. But the flip side is also true. Digital barriers to trade disproportionately impact these smaller players who don't have the resources or the expertise to adjust. The impact is compounded given these SMEs depend upon large US platforms and services who are often the explicit target of these digital trade barriers. Second, a digital trade criterion is perfectly aligned with the GSP's core goal, as data and digital services are now critical to modern development. Besides my own research on the issue, the World Bank's 2020 World Development Report finds that, and I quote, "Restrictions on data flows have large negative consequences on the productivity of local companies using digital technologies. Countries would gain on average about 4.5% in productivity if they remove their restrictive data policies, whereas the benefits of reducing data restrictions on trade in services would on average be about 5%, end quote. Third, reforms would ensure the administration uses the GSP program to support digital free trade. To date, the Biden administration's approach to countering digital protectionism is lackluster, to put it politely. US Trade Representative Tai is unwilling to pursue new, ambitious and binding digital trade rules like those in USMCA. Some in the administration and Congress have expressed fears that digital trade rules would prevent Congress from enacting sensible new laws on digital issues. But those fears are unfounded. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan have all long pursued new digital trade rules, and none of them have stopped them from enacting new laws and regulations in relation to competition, content, intellectual property, privacy, or cybersecurity. In conclusion, the GSP is only one tool in the US toolkit, but it is an increasingly important one. Adding an explicit criterion for digital trade barriers would ensure it remains relevant and effective. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cory. Now, Mr. Hausman, you are recognized.
All right. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Blumauer, Chairman Smith, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, members of the committee. As this committee begins the process of potentially renewing the Generalized System Preference, a unilateral tariff cut program, it is the union's hope that this body will take a more sophisticated approach to what we ask in return for that benefit. The GSP program was developed during a Cold War, two-superpower era, before China became the second largest economy. It is a program that does not account for modern multinational corporations and state-owned enterprises. GSP lacks sophistication, and when the data shows that the largest beneficiaries of a US unilateral tariff cut are importers of jewelry made of precious metals and high-end handbags, the USW believes we should demand more of countries that benefit from this program. This testimony will focus on several key issues for the USW that will ensure we meet the GSP goals of diversifying economically developing countries and grow trade without undercutting the American worker. This includes updating the import-sensitive list, improving the GSP rules of origin, aligning labor and environmental standards to reflect modern trade agreements, and restarting Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA. We need to recognize the threats to American workers if Congress does not take a more active role in managing GSP program. The USW, which represents over 20,000 tire workers, has previously raised before this committee the GSP program lowers a 4% tariff on tires. Our union has spent millions of dollars defending American workers, both union and non-union, against dumped and subsidized tires from foreign producers, many of whom are based in the People's Republic of China. We've highlighted to this committee that GSP countries are now seeing China's Belt and Road Initiative build tire plants. One country, Serbia, saw a plant built that can make 13.5 million tires, and imports into the US have since doubled. Cambodia, another GSP country, saw a 5 million unit tire plant constructed, where in press it is stated that the plant is built mostly to export into the US and Europe. Congress should not pad Chinese company profit margins by another 4% at the expense of the American worker. USW calls on Congress to add tires to the import-sensitive list. Next, the rules of origin standards of the GSP program are set at an absurdly low 35%. A GSP country can assemble a product with 65% of that good coming from China or Russia and then send it in tariff-free. US content does not even get a preference in this program. Personally, I would rather see an American rancher from my home state of Montana benefit from selling leather to a GSP country manufacturer than Xinjiang forced labor leather going into that handbag. The USW urges Congress to raise the rule of origin in the GSP program to at least 60% and incorporate American content into that threshold. The USW believes our values are important to export too. That is why the union and the American labor movement urge improved labor and environmental standards in the GSP renewal. In 2010, the AFL-CIO wrote extensive comments on how to update the GSP program, issues that still need to be addressed 13 years later. Some of these provisions have since been adopted in bipartisan passed USMCA, and Congress should not backtrack on labor and environmental progress made in modern trade agreements. That is why the USW joins the AFL-CIO in supporting updating labor standards as drafted in Ranking Member Blumenauer's American Worker and Trade Competitiveness Act. Finally, the USW strongly urges Congress to renew trade adjustment assistance with a GSP renewal. Congress has made a choice to enter into 14 comprehensive free trade agreements with 20 countries, and these agreements continue to create winners and losers. Over 500 workers at Republic Steel are losing their job because the company is moving most of its production to Mexico. Congress voted to renew our free trade agreement with that country. The least Congress can do now is offer benefits that have been available in one form or another since the Kennedy administration. In conclusion, USW urges this committee to update the import-sensitive list, improve the rules of origin, bring GSP to a 21st century labor and environmental standards program, and renew TAA if you move on GSP. My written testimony has other important trade policies that could be incorporated as well. It is an honor to represent our union before the oldest committee of the United States Congress. You have the power to balance American interests in global trade, and USW workers urge you to adopt our policy requests.
Thank you, Mr. Hausman. I appreciate all of your testimony here on the panel. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session, and I'll begin. In addition to the successful leveraging of GSP to address tariff barriers to U.S. ag exports, it's come to my attention that the ag sector relies on materials as well as...
We have three of us that are about to vote in the Budget Committee.
Okay.
If we could be excused.
Yes, we anxiously await your return from the Budget Committee.
Yes, you and me both.
Thank you. Budget action is a good thing. We know that the ag sector has relied on materials and equipment that fall under GSP. Mr. Gresser and Mr. Spronk, can you elaborate on or provide examples of how renewing GSP will actually help keep input costs lower for our ag producers? Mr. Spronk, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much for the question. In the manufacturing process we actually use citric acid and lactic acid in a process to improve food safety here. Those actually are imported in here, but yet the countries that we import those from actually has trade barriers against us, and so we believe that we're benefiting their, how should I say, economy by buying their products, but yet they're using products, or banning our products or having trade barriers to our products going back in. So GSP would be very useful as a tool for our administration to be able to utilize and open those markets up for us and to continue the trade both ways back and forth.
Very good. Mr. Gresser?
Yes, with respect to GSP's role in reducing costs, to tariff system in its role as a tax is the U.S. fourth largest tax, $90 billion a year last year. It is principally paid by buyers of goods, so retailers, manufacturers, families, construction companies, and farms. And there are quite a number of specialized products that are useful to agriculture that are GSP products. Irrigation equipment is a 2.4% tariff. Brazil and Argentina are alternatives to China. Shearing clippers for animals like sheep is 4%. Insecticides, 6.5%. And then there are a lot of more general use products that are also, I think, quite valuable to farmers. Building screws at 8.5%, plywood at 8.0%, worked stone and roofing slate 2.2% to 6%. So there are a lot of products where small businesses, agriculture producers get not a huge, but a useful break on tariff payments.
Very good. Now, speaking a little more broadly, can you discuss how GSP can bring partner countries closer to the U.S. economically, for example, with aligning standards or perhaps providing countries with alternatives to China and exporting American values, actually? And Mr. Garza, if you have some insight on that as well.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think in general, GSP has a huge impact on the developing country. There's multiple benefits. As you know, there's job creation. That's part of a positive result of these type of free trade agreements. There's improved infrastructure. There's transfer of knowledge. There's growth in the population, education, and all of this makes the beneficiary country worthy of additional investment. That is one of the main benefits I see in GSP.
Thank you. Mr. Gresser, are others wanting to add to that?
Sure. Let me give you two practical, real-world examples. While I was administering the system, I would occasionally do trips to kind of discuss the program, the eligibility rules. I'll take two of them. One was a visit to Fiji, 2018. Went to a ginger plant that was the country's main GSP exporter. They were employing about 300 women doing dicing and running machinery. So there's a job creation benefit. They were using, for the sushi grade ginger, vinegar that they'd imported from Oregon. They were using food processing machinery from manufacturers in Florida. So there was a lot of benefit economically as well as to the actual workers. The other example that comes to mind, visit to Uzbekistan. One of the benefit reviews we had for Uzbekistan was on intellectual property rights. We were able to talk through the concepts with them and give them some examples, like Bokhara carpets, very famous local product, a big employer, and the name Bokhara is very frequently taken by Indian or Pakistani or others to get additional value, and they were thinking, yes, that makes sense. We have some of our own IP that we would like to be defending. So there are ways GSP has brought us into closer contact with people, has helped governments think through issues that are important to us and see them not only as a demand, but something that might be useful to them.
Okay. Now there's been the accusation that GSP has undermined domestic production. Mr. Gresser, can you elaborate on how GSP can be fashioned, or how it already is, in terms of import-sensitive products?
Yeah, a couple things to mention. Just in the big picture, GSP is about $20 billion a year. That's as against about $440 billion in imports from Canada. So it's fairly small. It has, as an integral and important part of the program, a petitioning process where interested parties can ask USTR to remove a product from the eligible list. While I was working on the program, we had such a petition from USA Rice, which resulted in the removal of most rice products. We had such a petition from the Michigan Cherry Board, which resulted in the removal of cherry juice. So this is an important part of the program. It works, if there are particular products that are becoming sensitive, everyone has a right to file such a petition, and I'm sure the USTR professional staff and officials will take it seriously.
Thank you. Thank you again for responding to the questions. I now recognize Ms. Delbeni for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. The Constitution gives Congress authority to regulate foreign commerce, and that means we as a committee have to do the hard work and not let important programs expire. Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA, is a key program that provides job training benefits to American workers, and it's been expired for over a year. GSP, a critical foreign policy tool that helps poorer countries develop their industries, has been expired for nearly 3 years. In fact, Congress has let GSP expire 10 of the last 14 times it's been extended. The expiration of these programs harms our economy, worsens our ability to strengthen our supply chains, and reduce our dependency on China, and it damages the United States' reliability as a partner of choice for foreign countries. So sure, these programs need updating, but we need to move quickly, as we shouldn't let programs that American workers and our allies and partners around the world depend on expire. Mr. Gresser, I wonder if you could talk about on GSP, what has been the impact of the constant expirations and short-term extensions on the effectiveness of the program?
Yeah, that's a great question. I share a lot of what you said. The more a program expires frequently and for extended and unpredictable periods of time, the less likely buyers are to see it as a useful part of their long-term plans. They may see a few particular products as valuable to buy off and on, but something that requires significant investment or a long-term commitment is going to be harder to make. And in those sorts of circumstances, they will say, well, we could save a bit of money if we buy from country X, but we may lose that investment, and that is more of an incentive to stay where they are, to buy from China, to buy from the European Union, and so forth. So I think it's a debilitating effect.
Thank you. Both you and Mr. Hausman in your testimony talk about GSP currently having a 35% value-added rule of origin, meaning that a partner country can assemble a product with 65% of materials coming from non-GSP countries, including China and Russia. Additionally, American-made inputs are currently ineligible for our 35% content requirement, and neither inputs from some of our closest allies and trading partners. So I wondered, how should Congress consider updating the rules of origin in GSP? Mr. Hausman, I guess I'll start with you.
Sure. Looking back at USMCA negotiations, Ambassador Lighthizer worked really hard and diligently to raise the content standards in the auto rule of origin, for example. And this body has the ability, just the same, is to kind of set some prioritization. If you look at the auto rule of origin as an example, it was a stepped process. It has the ability to kind of, work through in an effort with ITC review. I've testified in front of the ITC in regards to that process. And I think you have existing policy examples that I think you can use to help upgrade and improve that standard and hopefully incorporate American content.
Mr. Gresser, anything you want to add there?
I think your point about accumulation and use of U.S. content is a very important one. I think that's something that seems to me like a good idea. I would like to know a little bit more, but more generally, the 35% rule of origin has been there from the beginning. It is something that shouldn't be sacred and should be looked at, but I don't think we can really predict what the effect would be of raising that standard. A lot of the GSP countries are quite small and simple places. They do not have a lot of local inputs. They need to bring them in from somewhere else. And it is not out of the question that a higher rule of origin would mean shifting back to China. I think in the case of travel goods, those products used to be made in China. So they used to have 100% Chinese content. Now they have, if they're coming from Cambodia, they may have some, but it's quite a lot less. So I think it's something that's worth exploring and looking at, but I would like to do it in a kind of rigorous way to make sure we understand the implications and the likely results.
Thank you. And we may not have time to fully go into this, but in your testimony, you highlight the ways that GSP's competitive need limitations, or CNLs, could be updated to improve the economic benefits of the program. I've also heard from several companies in my district who are concerned about how CNLs could lead to higher import prices, and I wondered if you could comment at all of how we update CNLs.
Yes, thank you for asking that. CNL limits the total amount of goods that a country can export under GSP, and if they exceed it, then they fall out completely, the good is removed. If the goal is to encourage buyers to source other than China, the CNL concept to me is one that we ought to re-examine. The way it works is to remove eligibility for something that a country is really good at, and that's a questionable concept. At a lower level, I think the bill that the late Congresswoman Walorski and former Rep. Stephanie Murphy put in last year was quite a good one, that it would shift the program from a dollar value limit each year to a percentage-based increase, make some other reforms. So I think that is definitely part of the program that is dated and needs some re-examination.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith from Missouri.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you for hosting this committee hearing, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here as well. Mr. Garza, your company chose to move its production out of China, so thank you. I hope more companies do that as well. But to what extent was the GSP program an incentive for you all to make that decision, and how could the program be improved to encourage others to also move production and supply chains out of nations like China?
Thank you for the question. I think for companies like Black Diamond, we're a company that makes highly technical gear, but we also have to have very conscious in terms of our pricing structure. The competition is very aggressive, and we do highly regulated personal protective equipment. So we cannot, our main criteria always has to be quality number one. But at the same time, we have the pricing pressure that the market and our competition outlays. We cannot go and charge whatever we need to for a jacket because we have many, many competitors that have very good jackets, potentially very, very nice pricing from a consumer standpoint. So GSP is a tool for us. It's one of the main tools for us to actually drive down our product costs. It's one of the main tools. And that, as a whole, I can't tell you we specifically take China and move the pieces of a product from one place to another very targetedly. As a whole, we have to optimize our supply chains. And our supply chains are complicated. We play in 33 different categories, from helmets to harnesses to ski poles to skis, et cetera. We have to optimize our supply chains. So programs like these, as a whole, help us tremendously. Now you ask, how can it be more beneficial? I'll tell you there's three main areas, frankly. Number one is the dependability of the program is essential. This 3 years lapse, 3 years on lapse, 3 years is very, very difficult for us to plan around. Supply chains are not Lego pieces. You do not just pick them up and place them. It takes a tremendous amount of resource. It takes a tremendous amount of time to move product around. Frankly, as we move product around, we are consuming a lot of human resource, where we would be rather creating better programs for our company, better products for our company, and more US jobs, frankly. So number one is the dependability of the program is absolutely critical. Number two is reassessing the products that are in the program. We don't want to harm US manufacturing, but if we looked at certain products like footwear that isn't manufactured here in the US, I think you would see a tremendous amount of shift like we saw with travel goods from China elsewhere. It would be a huge lift for our industry. Last but not least, we mentioned CNLs. CNLs to us is very similar to the dependability piece. It's not a sure thing for us. And as I mentioned, supply chains aren't Lego pieces. You cannot just pick them up and drop them into a place and then pick them up and move them again. For products like ours, we have a tremendous amount of scrutiny to go into a country, to go with a partner. So, in summary, three things. Dependability, relook at the products, and then improve CNLs, raise CNLs, or eliminate them.
Thank you. Mr. Hausman, it's great to see you again. In addition to bringing more of our supply chains home, we want to strengthen trade relations in our backyard. Currently, U.S. content is not counted towards the rule of origin regional requirements under the GSP like it is under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, trade preferences, and USMCA. Our trade policy should support American jobs at every opportunity. Should Congress consider changing the GSP rule of origin to allow GSP countries to purchase U.S. components to help meet the rule of origin, perhaps coupled with an increase in the 35% rule of origin threshold?
The short answer, yes. And look, our members make a host of products. The name United Steelworkers oftentimes belies the fact that we're the largest union in rubber, glass, paper, and a host of commodities, citric acid. So there's an opportunity here. If we raise the standard, we're asking our trading partners to do a little bit more for those producers in those countries. And then at the same time, American producers could benefit as well. And I think that that's a key element that really I think is a value to add to the GSP program.
Thank you. Mr. Spronk, given the Biden administration's disappointing lack of engagement to open new markets in the Indo-Pacific on behalf of U.S. agriculture, how might Congress consider updating GSP eligibility criteria to prioritize American farmers? For example, adding more specific criteria on agriculture market access when it comes to non-tariff barriers like food safety and biotechnology regulations foreign countries continue to use against American farmers.
Thank you very much for highlighting that and pointing that out. My career, I definitely benefited from lowering tariff trade barriers and non-tariff trade barriers. I started my career, we were a net importer of pork products into the United States. Through my career, between the last 7 months, or beginning 7 months of this year, we're exporting about 30%. That is because of free trade agreements. It is because of lowering tariff trade barriers. And I think that's one of the great things. And I'm here not because of my career. I'm kind of the gray-haired guy on the panel here. It's about the next generation, which is very important to agriculture. It's about my son and my daughter-in-law to be able to have the same opportunities that I did with trade. And trade is very important to agriculture. We are very productive. We utilize, you can see, when we get the opportunity to lower trade barriers, lower tariffs, we actually have the ability to compete and be very productive on exporting agricultural products. GSP is a prime example of that, where we have rules-based, where we actually give leverage to our negotiators and our U.S. government, whereby those countries can benefit from products that come into our economy, but also then we've got a tool that thereby we can actually export our products. Thailand and the Philippines are two prime examples of that, where we have tariff and non-tariff barrier restrictions. They're members of GSP, and so it's a great tool that we'd like to be able to utilize to we talk about diversification in agriculture. We want to broaden who we can export to. Those two countries can utilize GSP, and we think they have great potential for us to increase our exports too.
Mr. Cory, one of the major victories in USMCA was assurances that countries could not discriminate against U.S. companies when it comes to digital regulations. A few weeks ago, I led a delegation to Europe with 7 of my colleagues on this committee to address the new taxes European countries are planning to impose on U.S. job creators. With the proliferation of discriminatory digital service taxes, including among developing countries, should Congress consider updating the GSP eligibility criteria to include provisions related to countries engaging in discriminatory digital trade practices?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. And the short answer again is most definitely yes. As the Chairman Smith also mentioned, we need to bring up GSP so it's relevant for the nature of modern trade compared to what trade was like at its inception. And global trade is becoming increasingly digital, and unless the United States ensures that it's using every tool in its toolkit as effectively as possible, I suppose especially in the absence of broader, more comprehensive trade agreements, it needs to be used especially well. And the problem, especially so in the digital realm, is that there's a leader-follower effect. whether it's overly stringent and discriminatory regulation or taxes in Europe, or China's unique blending of digital protectionism and authoritarianism, we see developing countries, many of which are GSP beneficiaries, picking and choosing a range of different digital regulations to follow. And if there isn't a clear tool the United States can use to push back and hold them to account, then the nature of this digitalization of trade will fundamentally change as more and more countries adopt policies from one region or one country or the other. So I think it's important as Congress considers renewing it, updating it to ensure that it addresses the barriers affecting a large part of the United States' advanced technology economy, to ensure that it holds them to account and provides fair and reasonable market access for digital trade as much as it does agriculture and other products.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Sanchez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. GSP is the oldest U.S. trade preference program, and the program was conceived to help developing countries diversify their economies and transition them from foreign aid. And as Ranking Member Blumenauer noted, GSP needs updating to reflect the evolution of our trade policy, because our trade policy has evolved over time. And that's why House Democrats have worked hard to include common sense and equitable reforms to GSP, such as updates to the labor criteria in GSP and adding an environmental criterion along with trade adjustment assistance. With respect to China and GSP, to claim simply that GSP renewal would facilitate supply chain shifts out of China, I think is speculative at best. As we heard from Mr. Hausman with the steelworkers, GSP's rules of origin allow up to 65% of a product to enter the United States duty-free from any non-GSP country, such as China. And I hope that our conversation today underscores that a program that we developed 50 years ago needs a bit of a refresh. It needs a facelift, a more sophisticated approach that does support our developing partner economies, but also at the same time doesn't undercut the American worker. I'm going to start with Mr. Hausman. Welcome back to the committee. It's good to see you again. Much like the United Steelworkers, I strongly believe that our values are an important export. One GSP beneficiary country, the Philippines, is ranked among the world's deadliest countries for labor organizers. And in fact, since 2016, there have been over 50 trade unionists extrajudicially killed in that country. Can you tell me why countries with serious labor violations are in the program today? And what should we do about that as we consider updating GSP's mandatory criteria to ensure improvement in labor standards and support for workers who are trying to organize across beneficiary countries?
Sure. Thank you, Representative Sanchez. As you pointed out, over 50 Filipino trade unionists have been murdered in the country since 2016. And the idea that this is not a sustained and recurring event, there's nothing more chilling than finding out that the person that you are working with to try and organize your workplace to make it sure it's safer, pays better, is murdered or put on a red list. And this idea that I've heard a lot about leverage here, that various producers and others have been able to see GSP be used to leverage access to a market. Well, we should be using that leverage to also improve working people's lives in the 5th largest GSP beneficiary country. And this idea that, as is pointed out, if you increase their wages, their ability to bargain, their ability to purchase American goods increases as well. So there's this opportunity here, and we do have a systematic issue here. So this idea of sustained and recurring, adding it into our labor standards here in GSP, and on the environmental side. I've got here a report that USW here recently did on Indonesian tire workers, another significant beneficiary of GSP. And we have pictures of the living conditions in that country. And
I would ask unanimous consent to make that a part of the record. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks. And the pictures of the living conditions and the rent, where these people pay over a third of their rent to make tires that can be imported into the United States. It's abysmal, and our ability to influence that requires better labor and environmental standards in our programs.
Thank you. Mr. Gresser, I'm going to do this very quickly because my time is running short. But you obviously know the GSP program very well, considering that you used to administer it under the USTR. And so you know that the program in its current form doesn't adequately reflect how U.S. trade policy has evolved over time. And I understand your hesitation when Ms. Delbeni asked you about the 35% content rule, that we not just willy-nilly say we need to up it to a specific number. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on how do you think that our committee can work with stakeholders in the administration to see that the program is renewed but upgraded as well to perhaps a higher minimum content?
Well, the committee has...
Briefly.
Do I have time, a little bit of
Briefly,
time?
yeah, if you could be very brief.
Okay. The committee has a very good degree of access to the U.S. International Trade Commission, which is renowned for the sophistication of its modeling and analytical capacity. And they may, just as a suggestion, it may be useful to talk to them and see whether a change in the value add rule would be more likely to increase shifts to GSP countries or be more likely to deter people from using it, and whether that type of shift would be different for large middle-income countries as against least developed countries and islands. And that might provide a bit of a structure to think about whether changing the rule of origin is going to be a useful thing, and if so, how it might be useful.
Thank you. Thank you. And now recognize a previous chair of this subcommittee, Mr. Buchanan, who has done a great deal of work on GSP as well. Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all our witnesses. Been a good discussion. As a business guy for 30 years before I got here, I want to visit with you for a little bit. But before I do, in Florida alone, $285 million extra tariffs on businesses and a lot of jobs. Mr. Spronk, I want to touch base on a couple of things you said. What's the economic impact, GSP, to your industry, the ag industry, the pork industry, as you know it?
Thank you for the question. As I said earlier, you look at the trade that we've got currently going on right now, it's worth $61 per animal, and looking back in 2022, this year, the first 7 months, it's actually up to $64. And so anytime that we can create new markets for agricultural products, and it's not just about pork, it's also about our corn and soybean farmers that we actually utilize as feed, that it's very important to them, that we're indirectly exporting them.
Can you put it in more of a global, what's the big dollar amount in terms of impacting the industry in a negative way, and ideally jobs that, would hit if we got this worked out?
As I said in my testimony, we actually had over $12 billion that we export worldwide. And I think we started back in 1995 when we became an exporter. It's through the development of markets and actually from free trade agreements, lowering tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. GSP is a great program whereby we can have that reciprocal trade. I mentioned Thailand, I mentioned the Philippines. Those are two countries that we don't currently have free trade agreements with. Anytime that we can actually export more product, it comes back to benefit on the farm directly, in that right now, currently, about 36% of the value of our cutout is due to trade. And so anytime we can have new markets, it's very beneficial.
We're all really limited, but let me go back to your point on FTAs, and it's a little off the subject, but FTAs is something we talk about. We don't do anything this Congress, or really the last 3 or 4 years, and you mentioned 20 countries have FTA agreements. Some people think that it was something that was useful in the past but not useful today. But what's your thought about FTAs and additional markets? How would that impact your industry?
We can very clearly show you graphs where we started out with NAFTA, which is now USMCA. We talk about free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, South Korea. Every time we lower tariff trade barriers, every time we lessen those tariffs that are on our product, we increase our sales. It's been exponential from 1995 when we became a net exporter of products. And so give us a level playing field, give us a rule-based trading system, and we will export more product here. But we also need to diversify. We need some of those new countries, Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, that we don't have free trade agreements with. These are excellent ways that we can actually create new markets.
Let me ask, Mr. Garza, let me ask you, you'd hit your 3 points. Explain what you meant by dependability. Running a business, you want to know what it's going to cost you one way or the other to produce a product, and that's such a big number. You said, I think, $1.7 billion, the tariffs as it relates to your industry. But explain to everybody what you mean by dependability and why this is so important.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Mr. Buchanan. When I say dependability, I am putting on my hat as a operations and process engineer and supply chain professional. So for us to take a very technical product, a life-saving product, or a product that's used to climb a mountain, there's a tremendous amount of requirements for the product, for the materials, for the factories. So for us to be able to, when I say dependability, what I mean is we need to know that if we move a product to a different country, a different source, we don't have to second guess that 3 years later that we made that right move, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And for us to be moving product or chasing a better cost.
Let me ask you this.
Sure.
You said your third point was C&L. What does that mean, C&L?
C&L? Of course, I know what that means.
Yeah.
It's here.
I understand a P&L, but
No.
I'm talking about the C&L.
C&L.
Why don't you give a...
Competitive needs limits.
Okay. Yeah, give me that. I need that definition just to better understand.
Competitive needs limits. So basically what that means, Mr. Buchanan, is basically it's a ceiling of how much can be imported from a certain beneficiary country, if you will. And once you hit that ceiling, it's basically that GSP benefit is gone.
Yeah. Thank you. Back.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. We'll now proceed to 2-to-1 questions pursuant to a typical committee process. Mr. Hood, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this important subcommittee hearing today. I want to thank our witnesses for your valuable testimony here today and the conversation. I welcome the opportunity to visit about renewing GSP. As has been mentioned, one of our oldest and largest trade agreements. To put things into context, since the last GSP lapsed in December of 2020, U.S. companies have paid more than $2.6 billion in new tariffs. These tariffs pose a sizable barrier for small and medium-sized businesses that are looking, obviously, to diversify their supply chains and move production away from China. At the same time, the current market access provisions in GSP do not reflect the realities of the 21st century economy, as has been alluded to by many of you. I believe we should take a hard look at updating GSP criteria to include provisions to protect U.S. businesses from unfair trading practices like data restrictions, localization, and other digital trading barriers. Mr. Cory, I appreciated your comments expressing frustration with the current administration's lack of a trade policy, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region and with IPEF. I'd like to first discuss with you unfair digital trading barriers and how GSP can potentially rebalance the scales. As you mentioned in your written testimony, despite countries such as Indonesia and Brazil and Pakistan ramping up data controls and digital trade barriers like mandatory data localization and forced local data storage, these countries would enjoy tariff-free access to U.S. markets under the previous GSP criteria. Because of these digital controls, many small and medium-sized manufacturers are priced out of the same markets as their local competitors. With that, what are the consequences to these small and medium-sized enterprises based in the U.S. if such trade imbalances continue unchecked?
Thank you for the question, Representative LaHood. Appreciate your strong advocacy on a strong U.S. digital trade agenda. The short answer is that SMEs, digital technologies and the internet have changed the nature of trade in essentially removing the impact that geography has. And so it provides enormous opportunity for individuals and SMEs to access customers and markets to not only survive but grow. But they tend to rely, obviously they're very cost conscious, and they tend to rely on centralized IT services for them to operate around the world. And so when they run into these digital barriers in Pakistan, Indonesia and elsewhere, they can't enter. They can't sort of take advantage of these technologies, even though they sort of physically can now with them. And so it essentially pushes them out. And so this great benefit we see from digital technologies in trade is essentially removed. And in the absence of the US having either a trade agreement with these countries or with an updated GSP, the US officials are hamstrung in how effectively they can push back. And over time, this job of rolling these barriers back only gets harder. And so the sooner we have new trade agreements and updated GSP criteria to address digital barriers, the sooner SMEs and startups and individual traders can have certainty that they have guaranteed market access to these new, growing, emerging digital economies.
Thank you for that. And just as a follow-up to that, if we do not put forward stronger digital trade provisions, talk about the competitive advantage we continue to cede to China in this space.
Yep. Most definitely happening. Indonesia is a great example whereby Chinese cloud firms have gone into Indonesia and explicitly told the Indonesian officials that we are completely fine with data localization and other restrictions because it's what they're used to operating in China. And they're doing that explicitly to disadvantage US tech firms because they recognize that US firms obviously operate differently. And so there is this global competition in and around these regulations. And if the US firms can't rely on the US government to help them push back on these types of restrictions, US firms are going to lose out. And that will continue to happen in more and more countries as they also consider China-like data localization restrictions.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Next, I'll recognize Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for holding this hearing, and ranking member. I'm grateful because it's been so many years since we've talked about GSP, and it's wonderful to finally sit down and really examine it. Mr. Hausman, your testimony was fascinating. And the first I just came from a Joint Economic Committee hearing on retraining workers for the green energy environment. And one of the things that came up yet again was TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance. And you argue that we should do GSP with TAA again. How do we, one of the things I know that Chairman Blumenauer worked with and struggled with in the last thing is, how do we make TAA effective? That it actually really does retrain workers, especially when they're 50 or 55 years old?
Sure. I mean, look, I came out of the TAA program. I got a Master's of Public Administration from the program, and I've helped certify over 12,000 workers into the program. And I'm looking now, this committee has almost 60,000 workers with petitions waiting at the DOL. These are in their states. And I look at every one of these committee members has people that are waiting to see the ability to get some job training benefits. It's earn while you learn. It's the ability to go to school, make a small stipend to keep your home, have some healthcare benefits with an HCTC credit so you can maintain your kids' healthcare. These are all programs that have been strongly, they show effectiveness when you have the ability to go and complete a technical degree. I've seen nurses, helicopter pilots, all of them come through the TAA program. It's not always a rifle shot, but when it does work, it works great. And I really I can't emphasize enough, you've got almost 60,000 workers in the states of this committee just waiting to find out if they can even get benefits or not.
Thank you. You also made the suggestion that we take the environmental and labor provisions in USMCA and incorporate that to these GSP countries. And we love to brag on USMCA. It was bipartisan, and we got it done during the Trump administration. It was, we worked really well together on it, and we continue to brag that these are the strongest labor and environmental provisions in the history of mankind. Why not include them in GSP?
I honestly think it's just this question of like the policy will. I think this committee has a lot of strength. As I've been able to work now here for a number of years, and this idea that you guys could address sustained and recurring violations and adjust this affecting trade issue. One killed trade unionist affects a lot more than just of trade. And the idea that you look at the Guatemala case, where the AFL-CIO put forward a petition and it took 9 years before an arbitration panel. That's a lot of time for a regular working person to not know if they have rights or not. And so I think these sorts of changes and modernization of the GSP program are necessary.
Mr. Hassman, you also argued for raising the content from 35% up to 60%, making the China argument, the Russia argument. But I thought you had an interesting twist too, which is that American content, which is exported to one of these GSP countries, should be included in that percentage.
Yeah, I mean, this is the idea, is that we want to export more of our goods and we see that diverse supply chain. I think about USW workers that make the Gorilla Glass on an iPhone. They make that in Kentucky, and then they ship it across to the factories globally, right? There's this opportunity. We want as much manufacturing here as possible, but we want to ensure that if we are exporting, and when we are exporting, that we're exporting as much American content as possible too.
I have one last question for you. You suggested that we add pneumatic tires to the sensitive import list. Why did you pick on that one product?
So in previous years, tires have been a major export through the GSP preference program. We represent about 20,000 tire workers that we've fought 80 CVD cases now against, we've won 12 cases against 6 countries. And this idea that we would then have to now, Congress has the statutory ability to add an item. Like, steel has been part of the import sensitive list now since more or less the beginning of the GSP program. To add pneumatic tires is going to defend an industry with just that 4% margin that employs over 100,000 manufacturing workers in the United States. And I think it just makes sense. Why would we pad the profit margin of a Chinese SOE another 4%?
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize Ms. Miller for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this very important hearing today. GSP is one of the most necessary trade programs the United States has developed, and it's essential for providing fairly priced imports for American producers and consumers, as well as helping developing countries grow their economies to one day stand on their own. This program plays an essential role in spreading America's influence around the globe. The Biden administration's lack of focus on trade has severely weakened our standing among once key trading partners, therefore cracking the door open for Chinese Communist Party to take our place and exert their dangerous ideology. It is essential that we ensure that the GSP program is working properly in order to accomplish our goals and not undermine American producers of certain products, just like you said. We must be careful to not overburden the program with more government red tape. Businesses just want certainty, and we must work to ensure that as much of it as possible so that they can make safe investments and can trust their government not to pull the rug out from under them. Unnecessary oversight and continued uncertainty will have the unfortunate consequence of raising prices for American consumers, and this is not the outcome that we seek. Mr. Gresser, thank you for joining us today. Having worked under both the Trump and Obama administrations, I'm really interested in hearing your insights of the impact of GSP on the lives of workers in developing countries and the need for certainty when companies are making investment decisions.
Thank you. That's a great question. The impact somewhat differs by country, but it is generally quite positive. A program like GSP encourages some investment and some production in smaller and poorer countries. To the extent it does that, it draws workers out of informal sector and rural work into more jobs that are more likely to be wage paying, more likely to be covered by Social Security, limited hours and workplace health and safety laws. I was quite interested, for example, to read the International Labor Organization's Employment and Social Outlook report for the beginning of this year. They say that sectors with global supply chain integration with wealthy countries such as the United States tend to have a larger share of wage and salary employment, a lower incidence of informality, and a lower proportion of low-paid employment, and hence, in principle, a higher quality of employment. So it is generally a positive thing for them. It gives you also, as an administration, the opportunity to work on really problematic cases. The case of Uzbek cotton forced labor is a good example. The case of reforming the Georgian national health and workplace health and safety law is a good example. And so it does give you a lot of opportunities, both to create, in general, a better employment environment and to solve really serious and difficult questions. I would also say, finally, that the eligibility criteria are important, and it's important to enforce them, but they're not an unalloyed good. One case that was really kind of unsettling to me was not in the GSP, but AGOA context, a effort to reform the garment industry in Swaziland during the Obama administration did not succeed. The benefits for Swaziland were withdrawn, and the industry then collapsed, and all the workers lost their jobs, so they were worse off than before. So I think enforcement is important. The criteria are an integral part of the program, but we should look hard for the worst cases to focus on and not feel that the more cases we file, the better everyone will be. So there's a lot of judgment calls involved, but I think in general this is a success story for workers.
Well, one of the great effects of GSP is the impact on the lives of the people that are employed in the developing countries, often women. I've seen firsthand the impact of these investments in countries that can have workers who are women will have fewer options. I'd like to submit for the record some data that I've seen on products like sweaters that are overwhelmingly produced in China that should be included in GSP. Women tend to make these products, and I'm very supportive of pro-women GSP. Can you describe how more extensive reporting requirements could make the GSP program less effective?
In my testimony, that was a reference to there's been several proposals to add new criteria and several proposals to add for the USTR reporting rules and new reporting language. It is, I think I mentioned, important that administrations provide the public record of their decisions and rationales, but the number of people who work on GSP full-time is quite small. Typically, it's 2.5 or 2 1/3 full-time employees, and the more time they're spending on product eligibility petitions and enforcement and on explaining the benefits to other countries, the more the program is going to succeed. The more time they're spending on writing reports, it takes a bit of their time away from the day-to-day work that they need to be doing.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Murphy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually going to be brief just in the interest of time. As the chairman noted earlier, maybe that we went to Asia. And I just want to make a statement, Mr. Spronk. I'm in the #2 pork producing district in the country. It's a huge deal with Thailand, and I spoke kind of vigorously with them. I'm hoping that some of our efforts are going to open up their markets. This 1/6 of being able to remove should have been, 5/10, but anyway, thank you very much. It's a really important issue for our district and overall. With this, I'm going to yield the rest of my time to the great man from the state of Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'll just carry off of that, Mr. Spronk, and go to you. For your service on the National Pork Producers Council has afforded you insight into the unfair ag trade practices that countries seeking to utilize the generous provisions of GSP have levied against us. Please share how the GSP has not been successful at preemptively holding countries like India and Thailand, Mr. Murphy just mentioned that, accountable for effectively preventing the import of U.S. pork to their countries.
Thailand's a prime example of that. We actually did petition. It actually was in the that we found them to not be allowing our product to come in because of the expiration. We no longer have a leverage over Thailand to be able to allow our products in. And so I think we've lost a very important tool that we already had proven that Thailand was being restrictive to our products coming back in. So that is a prime example of what we have. We've used India in the past year. We actually leveraged to attain market access for U.S. products. The U.S. government's able to successfully negotiate. We're working on our bringing product into India here coming up. And so GSP has proven itself both in India and Thailand to be very effective using leverage to be able to allow our product to come back in. And as I stated earlier here, agriculture is sole product, lower tariffs, lower non-tariff trade barriers. That's all we ask in trade, and we will grow our trade export volume.
So it would require us to redo GSP to get those type of things in India and Thailand is basically what you're saying?
Vehemently so.
Okay. And how can the GSP be augmented to maintain American dominance in ag exports to beneficiary countries?
Very simple. Stronger enforcement mechanisms and actually more quickly responding so that it doesn't take so long to be able to do that enforcement. So those two things are very important to us.
And can you elaborate with respect to other competitors in the global pork market?
You don't have to look very far. When we go in, I just was in Asia last week, we actually saw a European product in freezers. The EU does use GSP. And so anytime that we are in an unfair advantage to our competitors, the EU, the 27 countries rolled up, they're twice as large as us. They're our main competitor. They're the #1 exporter in the world with all those countries rolled up. And so they have advantages that we don't. So it puts us on an uneven footing here. And so by allowing GSP to be renegotiated here, put us on an equal playing field, which is all that we ask.
Is there anything specific that you've wanted to respond to so far that you haven't had the opportunity to, that I haven't asked?
I think you've covered it very well. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Cory, I join many of my colleagues in raising concerns with China's malicious engagement in intellectual property, theft, and privacy invasion. While GSP serves to promote economic development and raise standards in developing parts of the world, some beneficiary countries have adopted many of the same digital trade barriers used by China with respect to data privacy and intellectual property rights. How can the U.S. leverage GSP enforcement mechanisms to protect American companies' intellectual property and data while also increasing market access in beneficiary countries?
A great question, Representative Stube. The combination of GSP criteria with IP and services and digital trade, I think together provide US officials with the key explicit points they can use, and when they go in there, as they're trying to address these barriers, whether they be digital or agricultural related. But they need those tools. In the absence of GSP, US officials have far limited options in terms of engagement and pressure to get them to reconsider these approaches. And without there being clear cost to these GSP countries enacting these types of restrictions, then the more likely they are to succumb to copying and pasting the type of policies that we see in China. And overall, it undermines sort of broader US engagement on privacy, cybersecurity, secure critical infrastructure and such. So again, GSP, an updated GSP is a critical tool in the toolkit the US can use to try and fight back against Chinese style economic, tech and other sort of human rights related concerns.
Thank you. My time's expired. Actually, Mr. Murphy's time's expired. I yield back to Mr. Murphy, who's not here, whose time's expired.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry for the detour to the Budget Committee. Mr. Gresser, your latest email hit perfectly timed for the hearing, and we really appreciate your long-term interest and thoughtful approach, and appreciate your being on the witness stand today. I wondered if you could make an observation about the GSP proposal that we had advanced in the previous Congress and reintroduced, and how it aligned with the USMCA provisions that were adopted overwhelmingly by this committee and this Congress.
Thank you very much for the kind comment. Just quite grateful. In terms, I see GSP as is a small program. It's about 11% of imports from the countries. USMCA in principle is 100% of our two largest imports from our two largest trading partners, or two or three. So I think it's a somewhat different context. And the GSP countries are very diverse, ranging from small island countries and least developed states with...
Let me reframe the
okay.
question. I appreciate that there are differences
okay.
in terms of the GSP target countries and North America. I'm asking how congruent the provisions we had with UMSCA with the GSP legislation that we advanced.
Okay. To my understanding, I think they are aligned fairly closely. There are, I do think that there's not, I don't really see it as essential to align them. They're two quite different programs.
I wasn't
okay.
asking
yes.
the merits of it.
Okay, yes, I take...
whether or not what we put in the GSP legislation aligned rather directly with what we approved overwhelmingly with the USMCA.
I think they do align fairly closely.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, that is a point that I think is important. We advanced a GSP proposal that is completely congruent with what this committee had passed before. There are issues in terms of environment and labor rights and transparency and whatnot, but we did that and offered it up as a way to break the gridlock with GSP. And I'm sad that something that has been approved by virtually everybody on this, I think everybody on this committee, was not good enough. And instead, people wanted to hold GSP hostage. We don't. It was an effort to try and move past the impasse and find an area of common agreement so we wouldn't be caught up with this and that we might be able to go forward with other issues. I appreciate the references, for example, to digital trade. I think, Mr. Chairman, there's interest in diving in and doing more, and I'm open to that. But I just want to make clear that we have a viable GSP proposal that is consistent with what everybody on this committee already approved. And if it's important, it seemed to me we should move forward with it. Mr. Hausman, I wondered if you referenced in your testimony loopholes in terms of GSP's labor and environmental criteria, particularly sustained and recurring and affecting trade. Would you elaborate on the impact of that approach as opposed to what we did, for example, with USMCA?
Yes, Ranking Member Blumenauer. I look at the sophistication of some of the countries that we are going to provide a benefit for, like Thailand, Indonesia, Brazil, Cambodia, the Philippines. And with the Philippines, we've mentioned here Indonesia, the omnibus law that has undermined labor rights in that country. The ability for us to highlight that this is a sustained and recurring event. And the idea that we're going to have to also prove that this affects trade when we know that $15 billion, just in nickel, $15 billion of investment, primarily from the People's Republic of China, have gone into that country. And I've met with some of the Indonesian miners, and those horror stories that they tell of how they're treated, and this idea of in an economy where we really need to advance this momentum on EVs, et cetera. But the idea that that isn't going to be affecting trade, it's really bad.
Time's expired. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Fischbach for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate that you guys are hanging in there because it's been kind of a crazy day and lots of people running all variety of places. But Mr. Spronk, I want to especially welcome you. You're one of my constituents, and I appreciate you coming all the way out here to talk to us about very important issues, serious issues. And I just wanted to. Mr. Stubbe asked, kind of started down the road that I wanted to ask about, and so I've got kind of, I guess maybe you could call them follow-up questions, but The Asian Pacific region is historically a large beneficiary of the GSP status. And on top of that, and specific to you and pork, that region also happens to be a big area of opportunity for the U.S. pork exports. Can you speak to the opportunity cost for U.S. pork every year that GSP remains lapsed?
It's not very difficult to identify the opportunity for us in agriculture, and specifically pork, the ability to export to Asian countries. Large populations, cultural propensity to eat pork, lack of self-sufficiency domestically, and actually, as you know, about African swine fever in several of the Asian countries. And so there is a demand within those countries here that's very important to us. And I think one of the things to recognize that while we are very competitive, typically when we go into a country, Colombia is an example, when we got our free trade agreement, low teens on the per capita consumption. We actually worked in country with their local producers, and today it's double that. And so it's not only that we come in and overtake the domestic production, actually we create the opportunities for increased demand and increase for safe, affordable protein to come into those countries. So while every time that we have a lack of execution of the GSP into Thailand, into the Philippines, into other GSP countries, it does limit our ability to be able to export into those countries and then increase our exports.
And you mentioned several other countries in your testimony where GSP could be leveraged to address unjustified tariff barriers. Ecuador, Jamaica, and South Africa were ones that you listed in your written testimony. And I just want to provide you an opportunity to maybe expand on those thoughts and talk a little bit about that, why GSP might provide a tool to address them.
Well, very clearly, as I talked about earlier, we're looking to diversification. We want to broaden our palette with the product that countries that we can export our product to. We wanted to be able to differentiate our product from our competitors. Anytime that we can grow a new market, anytime we can open up a new market, while it might start at lower levels of exports to our country, we know that once we get access, lower tariffs, lower non-tariff trade barriers, our products continue to be wanted by those countries, and we continue to grow exporters in those countries. Our track record in our top countries that we export here just continue to add value and volume in there. So while we hesitate here on GSP and opening up those countries to us, that's not allowing us that opportunity to lay that foundation, to lay it brick by brick, so that we can actually export more to those countries, specifically as you talk about the Asian countries.
Well, and thank you very much. And I just, 1/3 of what we produce in Western Minnesota is exported, and so it's so important that we have the opportunity for those export market access. And so I appreciate you being here, and it's something that we're working on and continue, because I understand the importance of it, and appreciate you being here to talk to us, and all of the efforts of so many of the groups, the ag groups in our area. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Fischbach. I now recognize Mr. Kildee for 5 minutes.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing and for the work that you and I have been able to do together over the past few years on issues regarding trade. I look forward to continuing that. Before I go on, I've often mentioned that I'm from Flint, Michigan, but I do want to acknowledge the former mayor and a longtime friend of mine, Dane Walling, who was the mayor of the city of Flint. Welcome, Dane. Good to see you. Have I mentioned that I'm from Flint?
No,
Yes.
yeah.
So, look, I do support the efforts that this hearing is intended to focus on. Having a more forward-thinking and proactive trade agenda is something that I very much support. Our Constitution, in fact, is very clear, as we have noted on this committee, that Congress has the authority to regulate international commerce, and I believe that we have to, in this committee, lean in on that responsibility. In the last Congress, led by Mr. Neal and Mr. Blumenauer, we did introduce legislation to update and reauthorize numerous trade-related programs. We have legislation that would do that, including GSP, but also importantly, trade adjustment assistance, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's another important program that, of course, has expired. Our legislation seeks to support U.S. workers and increase American economic competitiveness. That's the goal of our work. That ought to be the goal of trade. Our bill would also seek to address reducing or suspending tariffs on specific imports. And I strongly believe that there is a bipartisan majority, Democrats and Republicans, that can carve a new path forward to promote fair trade for our constituents and the people that would benefit from that. I was very proud to work with the past administration, even with former President Trump, on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement because it included newer, stronger enforcement mechanism that holds our trading partners accountable. And I've been proud to work with you, Mr. Chairman, on ensuring that that agreement lives up to its commitments and the promise that it holds, including for our farmers. The GSP program offers preferential trade benefits to other developing countries, and I believe that updates are absolutely necessary to the GSP program, including incorporating stronger environmental, labor, and human rights standards to make them work better. These changes would be similar to provisions of USMCA and the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, that have helped support American workers and workers around the world. And I noted, Mr. Spronk, in your comments, very specifically mentioning the need for stronger enforcement. None of these policies or trade agreements are worth anything unless we have a mechanism for enforcement. Improving the quality of life for workers around the globe is both a moral and economic responsibility, but we also have to focus on expired domestic programs like trade adjustment assistance that helps those workers, like people in my own district that have been hurt by past trade deals. So I wonder, in the 2 minutes or so remaining, if Mr. Hausman, if you would mind commenting on how workers who have been impacted by trade agreements could be benefited by trade adjustment assistance legislation as we make this adjustment, particularly in the light of the need for stronger trade agreements in the first place. If you could just comment briefly on trade adjustment and how that might impact those workers.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. Listen, the TAA program, this idea that all because we didn't enter into a new free trade agreement that jobs aren't lost. I've got 500 workers in Ohio and New York who are losing their jobs because a Mexican parent company is moving that production to Mexico, and they're moving equipment down there. Under normal circumstances with a reauthorized TAA program, those people would be able to get job training benefits so that they could get back into the workforce faster. This is something that is sustained and recurring, for lack of a better word. I mean, this is an event that continues to happen, and there's winners or losers when Congress chooses to lower and adjust tariff barriers. And I think that that's something that's key, that why we think TAA should move with GSP. It's a very straightforward program. It provides a good benefit. I've seen the benefit that it provides, and when you talk to a community college that does those training programs and sees that ability to see federal funds come in to help train those workers to become those mechanics, to become that next generation of worker. And when you're 50 years old after spending 20 plus years at a plant, that opportunity to kind of retool is absolutely necessary. So we strongly believe that this committee, who has jurisdiction on the issue, can move it forward. And we can talk about these broader issues related to Trade Promotion Authority another time, and we can maybe, anyway. But yes, thanks.
Well done, I appreciate that. I thank the panel for your testimony. I thank Chairman for holding this important hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I echo the sentiments of my colleague from Flint, Michigan, in regards to our appreciation for all of you for being here. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this important hearing, but obviously one that I believe is overdue. GSP has been expired for nearly 3 years now, and it's a lapse that really is undermining the goals of the program, once again, in my opinion. As a result, I think what we're seeing are businesses which have incurred uninspected duty costs, and consumers have faced higher prices. Businesses have slowed investments in GSP countries given the uncertainty of reauthorization, and production of GSP-eligible goods have moved to China in spite of 301 tariffs meant to do the opposite. We've lost an important leverage point to ensure a beneficiary is providing fair access to markets and protecting U.S. intellectual property. And most importantly, however, developing nations have been deprived of benefits that can help grow their economies, lift workers out of poverty, and improve conditions for workers. So the first priority should be reauthorizing GSP, for which there is bipartisan support, I'm proud to say. Now, obviously, I'm supportive of making improvements to the program, but we should not let potential disagreements on these policies stop us from reauthorizing this very critical and important program. And we need to keep the needs of developing nations that benefit from that program, I believe, at the center of the discussion. Now, GSP, I think, as we can agree, exists to foster economic growth in developing countries. So while benefits to consumers and U.S. businesses are a bonus, the success of the program should be measured by the economic outcomes of those countries. Mr. Gresser, in what ways has the GSP program kickstarted industries in GSP countries? And then a second question is, and you can tie it in, please, have workers in those countries fared especially, how have they fared in those employed by manufacturing GSP eligible goods?
Thank you for that question and for that very eloquent statement. A couple of examples. Cambodia is a good study in the benefits workers can draw from participation in trade. Phnom Penh is full of young women workers who have come in from rural areas where there are very few opportunities. Typically there, the boys will inherit the farm and get jobs in the army or whatever, and the girls sit around and wait. By taking a job in a factory, and there are, the last time we checked, there were probably 35,000 young women working because in the travel goods eligibility. What I was told by World Bank people was having one daughter in a factory raises a rural family's food security from 6 months to 2 years, and having two raises it from 2 years to, we have now enough money to buy irrigation equipment and start raising food to sell. And the women in these factories, they are now able to save money, to start their own businesses, to go into marriages with a lot of capital and equity. So it is very useful for young women workers, and I think that applies in quite a lot of countries. With the expiration, I was studying Solomon Islands, a small island country. They have lost their tuna exports to the United States. Whatever workers were involved in that, they're probably struggling right now. So there's both the value to having it and a cost to not.
Great, thank you. Now, obviously GSP, unfortunately, I should say, also has a history of lapsing and is currently, like I said, in a 3-year lapse. And that makes it hard to plan, I think we can all agree. However, we've also seen the need to update GSP at the same time. So I guess, Mr. Gresser, how can we have that balance? And what I mean by that is, how can we balance the need for businesses to have certainty, but also the appropriate expiration dates that provide an opportunity to update the program? Where can we find that balance, if you can try to hit on that?
It's a great question, not one that I have a ton of expertise on, but renewals of 1.5 years or 3 years are quite short. Almost as soon as you have it back up online, you begin thinking about how do we get this up online again. So African Growth and Opportunity Act and Haiti program are 10 and 15-year reauthorizations. GSP probably doesn't need to be that long, but 5 years I think would be kind of a minimum.
Great, thank you, appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen, and Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Winstrup, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that the committee is holding this hearing today. And I just want to say I strongly support efforts to renew the generalized system of preferences and other trade programs. Last Congress, the Senate acted on a bipartisan basis to renew this critical trade program for 6 years with reasonable reforms to the program's eligibility and criteria. I know Ways and Means Republicans unanimously supported that effort. Some have insisted on holding up GSP and other trade programs that would have reduced tariffs, eased inflation, and help continue our efforts to diversify supply chains away from China towards more reliable trading partners. So I hope that the productive discussion that was had today will lead to the House passing a strong bipartisan bill to renew GSP as soon as we possibly can. However, I'd like to note that while GSP is our oldest and largest trade preference program, it's certainly not our only one. In 2020, I'm proud to work with Congresswoman Sewell to enact bipartisan legislation to renew the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act for 10 years. This program provides duty-free access to the U.S. market, to our Caribbean neighbors, and most notably Haiti, From 2016 to 2010, in successive bills known as the HOPE Act, HOPE 2, and the HELP Act, Congress extended further preferences to Haiti to aid the poorest nation in our hemisphere as it struggles and have struggled with economic downturns and the horrific 2010 earthquake. So HOPE Help as a program, as is now known, expires in exactly 2 years in September 2025. And I think it's critical that we renew HOPE Help now before it expires, as we unfortunately saw with other preference programs like GSP. That's why today I did introduce the Help Extension Act of 2023, which would extend the HOPE Help preferences for 10 years through September of 2035. By extending the HOPE Help program, the United States can send an important message of support to our friends and neighbors in Haiti who are dealing with horrific humanitarian crisis as a result of gang violence and political instability. This legislation is also important for our economy, as it will continue the work Congress is doing to provide incentives to nearshore our supply chains, diversify away from adversarial trading partners like China. So I look forward to working with our colleagues on this committee to build bipartisan support for renewing and building on this important trade program. And I just want to thank all of you for being here today and for us to be able to have this important discussion. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Winstrup. I now recognize Mr. Schneider for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's been one of those days. I've been next more times today than I can remember, but I want to thank the witnesses for your patience today. Mr. Garza, not a question. I just want to share. I told my son that you were on the panel, and he was very excited. He buys his mountain climbing, his skiing, his ice climbing. He says he's made your company very profitable, and
we appreciate his business.
So, but more importantly, and you touched on it, how I think the point you made about supply chains use Lego blocks, but the idea that it's just not possible to, I'm going to stick with the chain metaphor, you can't move in a link in and out willy-nilly. It right. takes time, and there's been a burden. This is also one of those cases where everything's been said, not everyone said it, but I'll say it again. GSP is our oldest program. There's a, for lack of a better term, altruistic aspect to it of giving countries that are struggling a chance to lift themselves up. All of you have touched on the impact it has when it's working well and the adverse impact it has when it breaks down. We have support on both sides of the aisle, as Dr. Winstrup mentioned before, and others have. We need to address this and work to bring it back and reform it, make it more reliable and more responsive to our needs, which is, I guess, where my question is going. And I'll start with you, Mr. Gresser. It's not just that we're helping other countries. This helps us. And as we're at the end of the conversation today, could you reiterate the benefits, why it's in our interest as a nation to have GSP in place and stable, not just the benefit of the countries that we're trading with?
There's a number of values to it. It helps us build relationships with countries that often are not on the front pages. It provides some useful cost savings for a lot of American businesses who are buying GSP products. It provides an opportunity for us to pursue goals such as improving labor standards, such as market access, such as intellectual property rights. I do endorse the idea of having an environmental criterion. I think that is something we could also pursue through it. So whether you're thinking about a bit of benefit for the U.S. economy, a bit of diplomatic activity and benefit, or a bit of help for important U.S. priorities, GSP is a useful tool and a kind of a proven one.
Right, something that benefits us, and thank you. And Mr. Spronk, you talked about how it's affecting pork producers, the return on our investment. Can you put that into a context as we close out here?
You know, it's very simple. Simply to state there again, from the beginning of my career today here, the value that we've received as a portion of our cutout, or what we receive for those primals, has increased every time we have a new free trade agreement. Last year was $61 per head. The first 7 months of this year is $64. Every time we increase volume, we actually increase the value back to not only pork producers, but also create market for our corn and soybean producers. So we just can very closely correlate every time we have new free trade agreements, every time we lower those tariff barriers, we actually add more product because we are that competitive as U.S. producers.
So if I summarize, it's a win-win, and the wins keep getting bigger.
Very much so. I'd agree with that wholeheartedly. We understand, the value of lowering tariff barriers, lowering tariffs really impacts our ability to be able to move those products. And actually, we have a product, most time those Asian countries, they're moving their income levels up to middle class. They're wanting more protein in their diet. Was just recently in Asia, and they're doing home meal replacements with American beef and pork. That's the center of the plate in here. And so they actually want our product here to be able to move in at lower tariff barriers. And so there again, give us a level and fair playing field. We will increase our exports and the value back to America.
Thank you. And I'd go down the whole row if I had more time, but I'll close with this. This is about helping our country, helping our workers, helping our agricultural producers. It's about supply chains, and it's bipartisan. I think that's one of the most important things we should emphasize, especially in this moment. I'm proud with my colleague, Representative Steele from California. We introduced the Medical Supply Chain Resiliency Act that would give the president more ability to manage that. We can tackle a lot of the challenges we face when we work together. And so, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for having this hearing. Thank you for letting me join this subcommittee today to address it. I learned quite a bit, and I look forward to working together to try to get this over the finish line.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Blumenauer, as well. I appreciate the dialogue that we've had, certainly timely. The input from our panel here, I appreciate as well. I know that there have been, proposals made. I acknowledge that. I think there has been interest along the way of advancing this, and sadly, it has lapsed for now almost 3 years. I think that it's important to note, reflecting on my own concerns, that previously there was some language that was ambiguous, hard to enforce, that I think ultimately could maybe even set the program back a bit. And I think to take some of the standards and go beyond even USMCA, which has that type of approach that has had so much support, I think was particularly problematic. But I'm glad that we can have this discussion. And Mr. Hausman, I have to say that your concerns, I hear those. And I think a lot of those concerns we could address in future trade agreements, straight up trade agreements that are enforceable, that have high standards, rules-based, and involve some market access. And I think across our economy, it is so important to note that the U.S. footprint around the world, ultimately, we want U.S. companies to succeed. We want, even more so, we want U.S. consumers to thrive with good policy, a growing economy, growing opportunity, and that growing economy and opportunity, that's the rising tide that lifts all ships. And if we, I do worry that more and more trade restrictions, just adding on more restrictions one after another, it's really a race to the bottom. And that turns what would otherwise be a win-win scenario, as described here a minute ago, into a lose-lose. And we definitely want to avoid a lose-lose scenario where we, consumers don't buy goods because they're too expensive and no one else can sell them anyway because of various restrictions. So I think this has been a good dialogue, a good discussion, one that we can move forward with, I think, with open minds and the urge to get things done here. Anxious to continue to work on the miscellaneous tariff bill as well. Those have traditionally, with GSP, MTB has traveled together. And ultimately, though, it's about strengthening our domestic companies and our consumers. So let's continue to keep the dialogue going, and I look forward to further input along the way. Please be advised that members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers from the panel will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.